The school bell rang, echoing through the hallways, signaling the start of another ordinary day. The sound of shuffling feet, lockers slamming shut, and muffled conversations filled the air as students rushed to their classrooms. Among them was Mia Carter, a bright, ambitious black student with a passion for creativity and a knack for standing out. Her curls bounced as she walked confidently into her history class, phone in hand, a smile playing on her lips. Mia was the kind of student who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and her friends admired her for it. But that day, something unexpected was about to change everything. Miss Delaney, the history teacher, was known for her strict rules and no-nonsense attitude. With her sharp glasses perched on her nose and a stern expression that rarely softened, she ran her classroom like clockwork. Every student knew her golden rule: no phones in class. It was a rule she enforced with an iron fist, but to Mia, it felt outdated and over the top. After all, technology was a part of their world now. Why fight it? The class started like any other, with Miss Delaney diving into the day's lesson about the civil rights movement. The irony wasn't lost on Mia. She was intrigued by the topic, but couldn't help glancing at her phone, where a group chat buzzed with excitement about the upcoming school dance. Her fingers itched to respond, and after a moment of hesitation, she slid the phone beneath her desk and began typing quietly. Unfortunately, Miss Delaney's eagle eyes caught the subtle glow of the screen. Without missing a beat, she marched down the aisle, her heels clicking ominously against the linoleum floor. The room fell silent, and every student watched with bated breath as the teacher stopped at Mia's desk. "Mia," Miss Delaney said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife handed over. Mia froze. Her fingers tightened around her phone, and for a split second she considered refusing. But the weight of the stares from her classmates bore down on her. With a resigned sigh, she placed the phone on the desk. Miss Delaney snatched it up, and to everyone's shock, slammed it onto the floor. The shattering sound of glass echoed in the silent room, followed by gasps from the students. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the fragments of her phone, disbelief and anger bubbling within her. Her phone wasn't just a device. It was her connection to friends, family, and the small business she'd been building online. Miss Delaney turned back to the front of the class, unbothered, and resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened. But for Mia, everything had changed. Her mind raced as she fought to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew this wasn't the time or place. Instead, she sat quietly, her jaw clenched, her thoughts spinning with a single focus: this wasn't over. The next day, Mia walked into the classroom with a different energy. Her usual smile was gone, replaced by a determined expression that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. She had a plan, one that would ensure Miss Delaney understood the weight of her actions. It wouldn't be impulsive or reckless. It would be calculated, thoughtful, and ruthless in its precision. The classroom felt different as Mia entered the next morning. The air was thick with anticipation, though most students went about their usual routines, chatting and flipping through notes. Only a few dared to glance at Mia, their expressions curious, as if they could sense that something was simmering just beneath the surface. Mia, however, kept her head high, her steps deliberate. There was a quiet determination in her that hadn't been there the day before. She slid into her seat without a word, her notebook already open, pen in hand. Miss Delaney stood at the front of the class, her expression as stern as ever, reviewing her lesson plan. The moment felt like the calm before a storm, though neither the teacher nor the other students could have predicted what was coming. For Mia, the night before had been a whirlwind. She had spent hours replaying the scene in her mind. The sound of her phone hitting the floor, the way Miss Delaney's expression hadn't even flickered as she destroyed something so important to her. It wasn't just about the phone, it was about the principle, the disregard, the disrespect. It gnawed at her. She couldn't let it slide. Her friends had chimed in on their group chat. Those who hadn't been in class heard about it within minutes. Opinions varied. Some thought Mia should let it go and move on. "It's just a phone," one friend had texted. Others, however, were just as outraged as she was. One of her closest friends, Layla, had been particularly vocal. "That's not just her being strict," Layla had said during their late-night call. "That's her crossing a line. You can't let her get away with this." Mia didn't need much convincing. By the time she went to bed, she had a plan. It was more than just getting back at Miss Delaney. It was about making her understand what it felt like to be humiliated, to have something valuable taken away without fault. But Mia wasn't impulsive. She wasn't going to stoop to a teacher's level. Whatever she did, it had to be smart. As the lesson began, Mia's mind was only half on the topic. Miss Delaney was lecturing about leadership during historical movements. Ironically, a topic that felt deeply relevant to Mia's current situation. The teacher's voice droned on, her words sharp and precise, but Mia barely listened. She was focused on her notebook, where she was subtly jotting down ideas. Her handwriting was neat, her notes carefully coded so no one would guess their true meaning if they happened to glance her way. The first step, she decided, was information. If she was going to make a move, she needed to understand her opponent. Miss Delaney wasn't just a teacher. She was a person with her own vulnerabilities, her own flaws. Mia had learned enough from her favorite mystery novels to know that understanding your adversary was the key to any successful plan. After class, Mia lingered in the hallway, pretending to adjust her backpack as she kept an eye on Miss Delaney. The teacher was speaking with another staff member, her face animated in a way Mia hadn't seen before. It was strange to see her so relaxed, almost human. But then that was the point. Teachers often wore a mask in front of their students, but Mia knew there had to be cracks in it somewhere. She spent the rest of the day subtly gathering intel. In the cafeteria, she overheard snippets of conversations from students who had Miss Delaney for other classes. Most had the same complaints: too strict, too rigid, not approachable. But one story caught her attention. A senior named Jordan mentioned something about how Miss Delaney had a habit of checking students' social media accounts. "She's like a stalker," he joked, though his tone carried a hint of bitterness. That night, Mia sat at her desk, her laptop open. Her phone was gone, but she still had her old tablet, which she used to scroll through social media. If Miss Delaney was keeping tabs on students, it was possible she had some kind of online presence herself. It took a little digging, but Mia finally found it, a personal blog tucked away in a corner of the internet. It wasn't much, just a handful of posts about teaching strategies and personal anecdotes. But there, in one of the posts from a few years ago, Mia spotted something that made her pause. Miss Delaney had written about a disastrous first year of teaching, where she had struggled to control her classroom. The post was raw and honest, describing how she had almost quit because she felt like she couldn't command respect. "I learned the hard way that being kind doesn't always work," she had written. "Sometimes you have to take control, even if it means being the bad guy." Mia stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was it, the crack she'd been looking for. Miss Delaney's strictness wasn't just about discipline, it was a defense mechanism. She had built a fortress around herself, but every fortress had weak points. And Mia had just found one. The next day, Mia arrived at school with a new plan. This time, she wasn't just gathering information, she was setting things into motion. During lunch, she casually mentioned to Layla and a few other friends what she had discovered. "She's scared of losing control," Mia said, her voice low but firm. "That's why she acts the way she does. But what if we showed her what it's like to feel powerless?" Her friends exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. "What are you thinking?" Layla asked. Mia leaned in, a small smile playing on her lips. "You'll see." By the time history class rolled around, Mia was ready. She had spent hours carefully preparing for this moment, ensuring that every detail was perfect. As she walked into the room, she felt a rush of adrenaline. Miss Delaney was already at her desk, her expression unreadable as she shuffled through papers. Mia took her seat, her notebook open, and waited. The plan wasn't about disrupting the class or creating chaos. It was about subtly shifting the power dynamic, forcing Miss Delaney to confront her own actions without even realizing it. As the lesson began, Maya raised her hand, her tone polite but confident. "Miss Delaney," she said, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday about leadership during the civil rights movement. Isn't it true that leaders also need to understand the people they're leading?" Miss Delaney looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "That's correct, Mia. Why do you ask?" Mia shrugged, her expression innocent. "I just think it's interesting. Sometimes it feels like leaders forget what it's like to be on the other side, you know." There was a pause, a flicker of something in Miss Delaney's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. But she quickly recovered, nodding briskly. "A valid point. Let's get back to the lesson." Mia leaned back in her chair, satisfied. This was only the beginning. As the day went on, Mia's plan began to take shape. It wasn't about tearing Miss Delaney down. It was about forcing her to reflect, to understand, and maybe, just maybe, to change. "Would you like me to continue developing the story from here?" The days that followed were a careful balancing act for Mia. On the surface, she seemed to have returned to her normal self, focused in class, friendly with her peers, and diligent in her studies. But beneath that calm exterior, she was orchestrating a subtle rebellion, a plan that required patience and precision. Mia wasn't just acting out of anger. She wanted Miss Delaney to feel the weight of her own actions, to understand the ripple effect they had created. Meanwhile, the incident with the phone wasn't forgotten by the students. Whispers followed Mia wherever she went, snippets of conversations that ranged from sympathy to admiration. "She's so brave for standing up to her," someone had said in the cafeteria. Others marveled at Mia's composure, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. It wasn't just about personal pride anymore. It felt like Mia was carrying the unspoken frustrations of every student who had been on the receiving end of Miss Delaney's strictness. The real turning point came during a group project. Miss Delaney had assigned teens to research historical conflicts and present their findings to the class. Mia's group, which included Layla, Jordan, and a quiet but observant student named Ethan, was tasked with exploring the idea of power dynamics in leadership. The topic couldn't have been more fitting. As the group gathered in the library after school, Mia found herself naturally slipping into the role of leader. She guided the discussion with ease, her voice calm but decisive. Layla took notes while Jordan brainstormed examples, and Ethan, though reserved, contributed thoughtful insights. It was during one of these sessions that Jordan brought up something that made Mia's pulse quicken. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this whole thing about power, it's kind of like what happened with Miss Delaney. She smashed your phone because she could, right? That's a perfect example of abuse of power." Mia exchanged a glance with Layla, who raised an eyebrow. "It's definitely relevant," Mia admitted cautiously. "But let's keep the focus on the historical examples for now." Jordan shrugged, but the idea lingered in the air. Mia knew he was right. The parallels between their research and her own situation were striking, but she wasn't ready to draw those lines publicly, not yet. As the project progressed, Mia's plan began to evolve. She realized that her goal wasn't just to challenge Miss Delaney, it was to create a moment of reckoning. If she could make her teacher see herself reflected in the lessons she taught, maybe it would spark something, a shift, however small, in her rigid worldview. The opportunity came sooner than Mia expected. On the day of the presentations, her group went last. The other teens had done well, but their topics felt distant, disconnected from the present. When it was their turn, Mia took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Our presentation is about power dynamics in leadership," she began, her voice steady. "Specifically, we wanted to explore how leaders gain, use, and sometimes abuse their power, and the impact that has on the people they're supposed to lead." She glanced at her teammates, who nodded encouragingly. With Layla by her side operating the slides, Mia walked the class through examples from history, each one carefully chosen to highlight the complexities of power. She talked about leaders who had used their influence for good, as well as those who had let their authority go to their heads. It was during the final section of the presentation that Mia decided to take a risk. "What's interesting," she said, turning to face the class directly, "is that these patterns of power aren't just historical. They happen in everyday life too. We see it in our communities, in our workplaces, even in our schools." The room went silent. Mia could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, each one carefully calculated. She didn't name names or point fingers, but the implication was clear. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Miss Delaney stiffen slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Would you like to continue with the climactic resolution or explore another twist in the story?" The next morning, the school buzzed with an air of unease. It wasn't just about the video anymore, something deeper had shifted. Conversations among students felt heavier, and even the teachers seemed quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. Mia walked into her first class, her heart pounding. She had sent the email late last night and hadn't heard anything yet. What if no one took it seriously? What if it just made things worse? As the day went on, whispers started circulating that the administration was planning a meeting with the senior students. By lunchtime, it was confirmed. An announcement over the intercom instructed all seniors to gather in the library after the final period. Mia exchanged a nervous glance with Layla, her stomach twisting in anticipation. When the time came, the library was packed. Students were seated at the tables, while others stood near the walls. Mia found a spot near the back, trying to steady her breathing. At the front of the room stood Mr. Harris, flanked by Miss Delaney and a few other teachers. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Mr. Harris stepped forward, his expression serious but calm. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here today because our school is facing a moment of reckoning. Over the past week, events have unfolded that have exposed deep fractures in our community. It's clear that we need to have an honest conversation, not just about what happened, but about how we move forward." Mia's pulse quickened. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, but it also terrified her. What if they swept everything under the rug? What if this was just damage control? Mr. Harris continued, "I'd like to start by addressing the video that was shared. It was wrong to record and distribute it without permission, but it's also clear that the incident it captured reflects a broader issue. We need to ask ourselves, why did so many students feel the need to share it? What does it say about the relationship between students and teachers?" For the first time, Mia saw Miss Delaney look genuinely vulnerable. She stood with her arms crossed, her face pale, but her eyes seemed softer, less defensive. Mr. Harris turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Delaney, would you like to share your perspective?" There was a long pause before Miss Delaney spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "I've been reflecting a lot these past few days," she said. "The truth is, I've been so focused on maintaining order and discipline that I've lost sight of the bigger picture. I thought I was doing what was best for my students, but I see now that my methods have caused harm." A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Delaney looked directly at Mia, her expression unreadable. "Mia, I want to apologize to you specifically. I was wrong to handle the situation with your phone the way I did. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. I see now that I let my frustration cloud my judgment." Mia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not in front of everyone. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. But then she stood, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "And I'm sorry too, for how things escalated. I think we all have a lot to learn from this." The room was silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. But just as it seemed like things were settling, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. "What about the rest of us?" Everyone turned to see Ethan standing by the door, his expression intense. "It's great that we're having this conversation now, but this isn't just about Mia or Miss Delaney. A lot of us have felt unheard or disrespected, and it's not just one teacher, it's the whole system." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Ethan's words struck a chord, and murmurs of agreement began to spread. Mia looked at him, surprised but grateful. He was right. This wasn't just about her. Mr. Harris raised a hand, calling for silence. "Ethan, you bring up an important point," he said. "This isn't about assigning blame to one person. It's about acknowledging that we all have a role to play in creating a better environment. That's why we're going to be implementing some changes." He went on to outline a plan: regular forums for students and teachers to discuss issues, a review of disciplinary policies, and increased efforts to foster mutual understanding. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the meeting wrapped up, Mia felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a lingering unease. She was glad the conversation had started, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. That evening, as she was leaving school, Mia noticed Miss Delaney standing by her car. Their eyes met, and Miss Delaney gestured for Mia to come over. Mia's chest tightened. She had a sinking feeling that Miss Delaney was about to use the moment to reinforce her authority, to turn the discussion into another lecture about discipline and respect. Sure enough, the teacher continued, "We all have a responsibility to act with integrity, whether we're in positions of power or not. Leadership isn't about popularity, it's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." Mia's hand shot up before she could stop herself. "But isn't it also about understanding the people you lead?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with challenge. Miss Delaney's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. "That's true, Mia," she said slowly. "But understanding doesn't mean compromising on rules or expectations." Mia didn't back down. What if the rules themselves are the problem? A murmur rippled through the students, and Miss Delaney's expression tightened. "This isn't the time or place for that discussion," she said curtly. Mia nodded, though her jaw clenched. She had pushed as far as she could in that moment, but it was clear the conversation wasn't over. After the assembly, Mia found herself cornered by Ethan, the quiet member of her project group. "I think you're onto something," he said, his voice low. "But you're not going to get through to her in front of everyone. You need to find another way." Mia considered his words carefully. Ethan was right. Miss Delaney was too proud to admit any fault publicly. If Mia wanted her to truly reflect, she needed a more private, personal approach. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Mia stayed behind after class. She waited until the room was empty before approaching Miss Delaney's desk. "Can we talk?" Mia asked, her tone careful but firm. Miss Delaney looked up, her expression guarded. "What about?" Mia hesitated, then took a deep breath. "About what happened with my phone, and about power." For a moment, Miss Delaney said nothing. Then she gestured to a nearby chair. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." Mia sat down, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure how this conversation would go, but she knew it was her chance to make Miss Delaney see the bigger picture, to understand what had been lost, and what could still be salvaged. The room was quiet, the air thick with tension. Mia met Miss Delaney's gaze, her voice steady as she began. "I get that you're trying to teach us discipline, but what you did wasn't about discipline, it was about control, and it wasn't fair." Miss Delaney's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, hesitation maybe. "Fairness isn't always the priority in a classroom," she said. "Sometimes, maintaining order is more important." "But at what cost?" Mia shot back. "You talk about leadership and integrity, but leaders who don't listen lose respect. That's what happened that day. You didn't just break my phone, you broke trust." Miss Delaney's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue, but then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I didn't think about it that way," she admitted. "I was frustrated. I wanted to make a point." Mia nodded, her voice softening. "You made your point, but it came at my expense, and I think you know that wasn't right." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Delaney looked down at her desk, her hands clasped tightly. "I'll think about what you said," she finally murmured. Mia stood, her heart still racing. She didn't know if she had truly gotten through to her teacher, but she felt a small spark of hope. As she left the classroom, she couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of change, or just another moment that would be forgotten? Would you like to continue to the climax where the final confrontation or resolution unfolds? As Mia walked away from the classroom, the weight of her conversation with Miss Delaney stayed with her. She wasn't sure if it had been enough. Miss Delaney's words, though tentative, hinted at some level of self-awareness, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. She had spoken her truth, but whether it would lead to real change was out of her hands. Or so she thought. The weekend came, offering Mia a temporary reprieve from the whirlwind of emotions. She spent Saturday with Layla, doing their best to escape the heaviness of recent events by binge-watching their favorite show and eating far too much popcorn. But even as they laughed and joked, Mia's mind kept drifting back to her confrontation with Miss Delaney. It wasn't until Sunday evening that things took an unexpected turn. Mia was scrolling through her phone, catching up on messages and memes, when she noticed a notification for a new post in the school's unofficial group chat. Curiosity piqued. She opened it to find a video that made her stomach drop. The video wasn't of her, it was of Miss Delaney. Someone had recorded her in a heated moment with another student, this time during lunch duty. In the video, Miss Delaney could be heard reprimanding the student for being late to class, her tone sharp and unyielding. But this time, the student had pushed back. "Why do you always have to go so hard on people?" they'd said. "You don't even try to understand." The clip ended abruptly, but the damage was done. The chat was flooded with comments, ranging from students sharing similar experiences to others outright mocking Miss Delaney. Some defended her, saying she was just doing her job, but the majority of the responses were critical. Mia's heart raced as she read the messages. The video wasn't just embarrassing, it was incendiary. It painted Miss Delaney as an out-of-touch authoritarian, and Mia knew it wouldn't be long before the entire school saw it. She didn't condone Miss Delaney's behavior, but this felt wrong. It wasn't just about holding her accountable, it was about public humiliation. The next day at school, the tension was palpable. Whispers followed Miss Delaney wherever she went, and even the teachers seemed to be walking on eggshells around her. Mia noticed how her usually confident stride had slowed, how she avoided eye contact with students. It was a strange sight, seeing someone who had always seemed so in control, now visibly shaken. At lunch, Mia and Layla found a quiet corner to talk. "Have you seen the video?" Layla asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yeah," Mia said, her voice low. "It's a lot." "Do you think it's fair?" Layla asked, tilting her head. Mia hesitated. "I don't know. I mean, she's been unfair to so many people, but this feels different. It's not about teaching her a lesson, it's about tearing her down." "Exactly," Layla agreed. "And that's not who you are, Mia. You stood up to her because you believed in something. This is just cruel." Mia nodded, but the question lingered. What could she do about it? The video was already out there, spreading like wildfire. Stopping it felt impossible. The situation escalated later that day when the principal, Mr. Harris, called a surprise assembly. The entire school gathered in the auditorium, the air heavy with anticipation. Mia sat with Layla, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mr. Harris walked onto the stage, his expression serious. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began. "I wanted to address an issue that has come to my attention. As many of you are aware, a video of one of our teachers has been circulating online. This video was recorded without permission, and while I understand that tensions can run high, this kind of behavior is unacceptable." The room was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. "We are a community," Mr. Harris continued, "and as a community, we need to treat each other with respect, even when we disagree. I want to remind everyone that actions have consequences, not just for the person being targeted, but for all of us." Mia's chest tightened. She knew Mr. Harris was trying to defuse the situation, but it felt like a band-aid on a much deeper wound. The problem wasn't just the video, it was the culture of resentment and mistrust that had allowed it to gain traction in the first place. As the assembly ended, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. If anything, it felt like the stakes had been raised. The video had exposed cracks in the school's foundation, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. That evening, Mia found herself staring at her computer screen, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore what was happening, but she also couldn't condone the way it was unfolding. After a few minutes of deliberation, she opened a blank document and began typing. When she was done, she read over her words carefully. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, addressing the message to Mr. Harris, Miss Delaney, and a handful of other faculty members. The email wasn't an attack or a defense, it was a plea for understanding. Mia shared her perspective on the events of the past week, acknowledging the harm done on both sides and calling for a more constructive way forward. "This isn't about punishment," she wrote. "It's about accountability and healing." Mia didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had taken a step, however small, toward bridging the divide. But as she closed her laptop, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was still to come. Would Miss Delaney respond? Would the school community listen? Or had the damage already been done? The questions swirled in Mia's mind as she lay awake that night, the weight of the unresolved tension pressing down on her. The climax of the story was near, and Mia knew that whatever happened next would define everything. Mia nodded, her voice soft. "I just want things to be better for everyone." Miss Delaney smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Me too." As Mia walked home, she felt a strange sense of closure, but also the realization that this was just the beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time, it felt possible. And yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mia received a text from an unknown number. The message read, "You think this is over. It's not." Asterisk. Her heart skipped a beat. The conflict may have been resolved in the open, but the undercurrents of tension were far from gone. The road ahead would be anything but smooth, and Mia knew she would have to stay vigilant. The story had reached its climax, but the final twist left the door open for a future no one could predict. Mia stared at her phone, the mysterious text sending a shiver down her spine. She read it again, trying to make sense of it. Who could have sent this? And what did they mean? The words felt like a warning, but she reminded herself to stay calm. Whoever it was, she couldn't let them scare her. She'd come too far to back down now. The following day, Mia decided to show the text to Layla. As they walked to class together, she handed her phone over, her voice low. "This came last night. What do you think?" Layla frowned as she read the message, her expression darkening. "That's creepy. Do you have any idea who it could be?" Mia shook her head. "Not really, but it feels personal, like someone who doesn't want things to change." Layla glanced around the hallway, her voice dropping even lower. "You think it could be one of the teachers, or maybe a student who was upset about the assembly?" "It's hard to say," Maya replied, her mind racing. "But I think whoever it is wants me to feel intimidated." Layla leaned in closer, her tone serious. "Well, if they think they can scare you, they've got another thing coming. You've handled way worse." Mia smiled faintly, appreciating her friend's support, but the unease lingered. She resolved to keep an eye out for anything suspicious and decided not to let the message distract her from the progress she'd been fighting for. Over the next few days, things at school began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension between students and teachers had started to ease, and the forums Mr. Harris had proposed were already being organized. Mia volunteered to be part of the student leadership team, helping to plan the first meeting. It felt good to channel her energy into something positive, something that might create real change. Miss Delaney, too, seemed different. She was quieter in class, more reflective, and even smile at her students occasionally, a stark contrast to her previous stern demeanor. During one lesson, Mia noticed Miss Delaney pause to ask a struggling student if they needed extra help, something she wouldn't have done just a week ago. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. Mia could see that Miss Delaney was making an effort, and that was enough for now. One afternoon, as Mia was leaving school, she saw Ethan waiting by the gates. He waved her over, his expression unusually serious. "Hey," he said, "can we talk for a second?" "Sure," Mia said, her curiosity piqued. Ethan hesitated for a moment before pulling out his phone. "I got a weird text, too, last night." He showed it to her, and Mia's stomach dropped. The message was almost identical to the one she'd received, with the same cryptic tone. Asterisk, "You think this is over? It's not." Asterisk. "This is so weird," Mia said, her voice hushed. "Why would someone target both of us?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I think it's because we spoke up at the assembly. Whoever sent this doesn't want things to change." Mia nodded, her mind racing. "We need to tell Mr. Harris. This isn't just about us anymore, it's about the school." Ethan agreed, and the two of them headed to the principal's office. Mr. Harris listened intently as they explained what had happened, his expression growing more serious with each word. He took screenshots of the messages and promised to investigate, assuring them that their safety was his top priority. As Mia and Ethan left the office, she felt a mix of relief and frustration. While she was glad they'd reported the texts, the lingering threat made it hard to fully relax. Still, she reminded herself that she wasn't alone in this. For the first time, she felt the weight of a community working together, even in the face of resistance. The next week brought the first student-teacher forum, held in the auditorium after school. The turnout was bigger than Mia had expected, with dozens of students and teachers filling the seats. Mia sat on the stage with a small panel, including Ethan, Miss Delaney, and Mr. Harris. As the discussion began, it was clear that people were ready to talk, really talk. Students shared stories of feeling overlooked or unfairly treated, while teachers opened up about the challenges they faced in trying to balance discipline with empathy. It was raw and honest, and though the conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, they felt necessary. By the end of the forum, there was a sense of hope in the room, a belief that things could get better if everyone worked together. After the forum, Miss Delaney approached Mia. "You were great up there," she said, her voice warm. "I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in." "Thank you," Mia replied, genuinely touched. "And I'm proud of you too. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Miss Delaney smiled, and for the first time, Mia felt like they were on the same team. It was a strange but welcome feeling, one she hadn't expected when all of this began. In the weeks that followed, the mysterious texts stopped. Mr. Harris informed Mia and Ethan that they hadn't been able to trace the sender, but the lack of new messages suggested that whoever it was had given up. While the mystery remained unsolved, Mia chose not to dwell on it. She had more important things to focus on. The changes at school weren't instant or perfect, but they were real. The forums became a regular event, and the conversations they sparked led to tangible improvements. Teachers started listening more, and students began to feel like their voices mattered. It wasn't always easy, but progress rarely is. As the school year drew to a close, Mia reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the phone incident, the assembly, the texts, and the forums. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, but through it all, she had learned something important. Standing up for what you believe in can be messy and uncomfortable, but it's always worth it. One afternoon, as she was packing up her locker, she found a small note tucked inside. It was handwritten, with neat, looping letters. Asterisk, "Thank you for helping us see things differently. You've made a bigger impact than you know." Asterisk. Mia smiled, tucking the note into her pocket. She didn't know who had written it, but it didn't matter. It was a reminder that change was possible and that even the smallest actions could ripple out in ways she'd never imagined. As she walked out of the school for the last time that year, the sun warm on her face, Mia felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been hard, but it had been worth it. And though there would always be challenges ahead, she knew she was ready to face them, one step at a time. Little did Miss Delaney know, she had awakened a storm. Mia wasn't just going to reclaim her dignity, she was about to teach the teacher a lesson she'd never forget. Would you like me to continue the story or refine this introduction further?